Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. This podcast uses the format of a book review to explore the intersection of philosophical naturalism with paleo-conservatism within the framework of the revitalization of the Republican Party. We will be exploring politics, philosophy, psychology, economics, and sociology through a wide variety of books published both recently and historically. Thank you for tuning in. So, for today's episode, we will be looking at The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion by Jonathan Haidt. And this book is from January of 2013. It's copyright 2012, so written in 2011, 2012. Published in the beginning of 2013. It's pretty recent compared to some of the books that I review. And it's really, really good. So I would say that this is one of probably the top 2 books that I've reviewed so far and that I think are important for you to own. I would recommend you to go out and buy this book unequivocally. This book and the other book being A Conflict of Visions by Thomas Sowell. Own these 2 books and you will understand a tremendous amount of the point that I'm trying to make and the mechanism by which a modern understanding of human nature really reinforces the conservative position. So with that glowing endorsement said, I'm going to get into some of the contents of the book. Now there are, I believe, 8 sections here that I want to read. As always, I'm going to read a few sections out loud. And there's so much in this book. It's not tremendously long. I guess it's 376 pages that covers a broad range of topics of different things that I've talked about so far in the show and really brings much of this stuff together. So the sections I'm going to read are going to touch on a couple of the things that I've talked about so far. There are also parts of this book that touch on things I've talked about that I'm not going to read just because I don't have time to cover every portion of this book. He does talk about Durkheim a little bit. Some of the stuff from the book Suicide that I reviewed a few episodes ago. He talks a lot about people being partly individualist and partly groupish. He says part chimp and part bee. I guess the chimp being the more individualist and the bee being more groupish. And he talks about morality a lot and the biological foundations of morality. He talks about the different forms of morality that people have. And there's a lot in here. So again, go out, get this book, and read it. Highly, highly recommended. He talks in here a bit about the conflict between the rational faculties or the faculty of reason and the emotional or intuitive faculties and the sort of conflict between them. And that sort of relates back to the last episode with the System 1 and System 2. The fast and slow thinking. I had mentioned in that episode the use of the terminology, the elephant and the rider. That concept of the elephant and the rider comes from this author, Jonathan Haidt. And it's not presented primarily in this book. He has another book, The Happiness Hypothesis, where he first introduces the elephant and the rider concept. I don't have that book and I haven't read it, but this one dives a bit more into politics and sociology, a bit more than that other one does. I would like to read that other one, given how great this book is, but I haven't done so yet. So let me get in here and start reading one of the sections. I'm going to go ahead and read all 8 of these, and periodically I'm going to provide comments. Well, I'm going to provide comments after each section that I read, to tie it to the general premise of the podcast and tie it back to some of the things that we've seen thus far and begin to build on some foundations for some of the things that we'll be talking about in future episodes. I really think this book brings a lot of the stuff that we have talked about so far together. particularly the aspects of human nature that we've talked about. Some of the paleo-conservative political stuff that I've talked about, this book doesn't really touch on that quite a bit, but it does touch on politics a little bit. Obviously, in the title, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. So it does touch on both politics and religion, but there are a few distinct parts that I want to focus on, and one of them is this reason versus emotion dichotomy. So I'm going to get in here and start reading from an early portion of the book. And this is one of the ones where there are some inner quotes here. He actually quotes a section from Thomas Jefferson. So I'm going to go ahead and give an outer quote to start it off, and then I'll quote the sections where he's turning to Thomas Jefferson. So outer quote, he says, "Western philosophy has been worshiping reason and distrusting the passions for thousands of years. There's a direct line running from Plato through Immanuel Kant to Lawrence Kohlberg. I'll refer to this worshipful attitude throughout this book as the Rationalist Delusion. I call it a delusion because when a group of people make something sacred, the members of the cult lose the ability to think clearly about it. Morality binds and blinds. The true believers produce pious fantasies that don't match reality, and at some point, somebody comes along to knock the idol off its pedestal. That was Hume's project with his philosophically sacrilegious claim that reason was nothing but the servant of the passions. Thomas Jefferson offered a more balanced model of the relationship between reason and emotion. In 1786, while serving as the American minister to France, Jefferson fell in love. Maria Cosway was a beautiful 27-year-old English artist who was introduced to Jefferson by a mutual friend. Jefferson and Cosway then spent the next few hours doing exactly what people should do to fall madly in love. They strolled around Paris on a perfect sunny day, two foreigners sharing each other's aesthetic appreciations of a grand city. Jefferson sent messengers bearing lies to cancel his evening meetings so that he could extend the day into the night. Cosway was married, although the marriage seems to have been an open marriage of convenience, and historians do not know how far the romance progressed in the weeks that followed, but Cosway's husband soon insisted on taking his wife back to England, leaving Jefferson in pain. To ease that pain, Jefferson wrote Cosway a love letter using a literary trick to cloak the impropriety of writing about love to a married woman. Jefferson wrote the letter as a dialogue between his head and his heart, debating the wisdom of having pursued a friendship even while he knew it would have to end. Jefferson's head is the Platonic ideal of reason, scolding the heart for having dragged them both into yet another fine mess. The heart asks the head for pity, but the head responds with a stern lecture. Quote, "Everything in this world is a matter of calculation. Advance then with caution the balance in your hand. Put into one scale the pleasures which any object may offer, but put fairly into the other the pains which are to follow, and see which preponderates." End quote. After taking round after round of abuse rather passively, the heart finally rises to defend itself and to put the head in its proper place, which is to handle problems that don't involve people. Quote, "When nature assigned us the same habitation, she gave us over it a divided empire. To you, she allotted the field of science, to me, that of morals. When the circle is to be squared, or the orbit of a comet to be traced, when the arch of greatest strength or the solid of least resistance is to be investigated, take up the problem. It is yours. Nature has given me no cognizance of it. In like manner, in denying to you the feelings of sympathy, of benevolence, of gratitude, of justice, of love, of friendship, she has excluded you from their control. To these she has adapted the mechanism of the heart. Morals were too essential to the happiness of man to be risked on the uncertain combinations of the head. She laid their foundations, therefore, in sentiment, not in science." End quote. So now we have three models of the mind. Plato said that reason ought to be the master, even if philosophers are the only ones who can reach a high level of mastery. Hume said that reason is and ought to be the servant of the passions. And Jefferson gives us a third option, in which reason and sentiment are and ought to be independent co-rulers, like the emperors of Rome, who divided the empire into eastern and western halves. Who was right? Plato, Hume, and Jefferson tried to understand the design of the human mind without the help of the most powerful tool ever devised for understanding the design of living things, Darwin's theory of evolution. Darwin was fascinated by morality, because any example of cooperation among living creatures had to be squared with his general emphasis on competition and the survival of the fittest. Darwin offered several explanations for how morality could have evolved, and many of them pointed to emotions, such as sympathy, which he thought was the foundation stone of the social instincts. He also wrote about feelings of shame and pride, which were associated with the desire for a good reputation. Darwin was a nativist about morality. He thought that natural selection gave us minds that were preloaded with moral emotions. But as the social sciences advanced in the 20th century, their course was altered by two waves of moralism that turned nativism into a moral offense. The first was the horror among anthropologists and others at social Darwinism, the idea raised but not endorsed by Darwin that the richest and most successful nations, races, and individuals are the fittest. Therefore, giving charity to the poor interferes with the natural progress of evolution. It allows the poor to breed. The claim that some races were innately superior to others was later championed by Hitler. And so, if Hitler was a nativist, then all nativists were Nazis. That conclusion is illogical, but it makes sense emotionally if you dislike nativism. The second wave of moralism was the radical politics that washed over universities in America, Europe, and Latin America in the 1960s and 1970s. Radical reformers usually want to believe that human nature is a blank slate on which any utopian vision can be sketched. If evolution gave men and women different sets of desires and skills, for example, that would be an obstacle to achieving gender equality in many professions. If nativism could be used to justify existing power structures, then nativism must be wrong. Again, this is a logical error, but this is the way righteous minds work. The cognitive scientist Steven Pinker was a graduate student at Harvard in the 1970s. In his 2002 book, The Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature, Pinker describes the way scientists betrayed the values of science to maintain loyalty to the progressive movement. Scientists became moral exhibitionists in the lecture hall as they demonized fellow scientists and urged their students to evaluate ideas not for their truth, but for their consistency with progressive ideals, such as racial and gender equality. Nowhere was the betrayal of science more evident than in the attacks on Edward O. Wilson, a lifelong student of ants and ecosystems. In 1975, Wilson published Sociobiology, The New Synthesis. The book explored how natural selection, which indisputably shaped animal bodies, also shaped animal behavior. That wasn't controversial, but Wilson had the audacity to suggest in his final chapter that natural selection also influenced human behavior. Wilson believed that there is such a thing as human nature, and that human nature constrains the range of what we can achieve when raising our children or designing new social institutions. Wilson used ethics to illustrate his point. He was a professor at Harvard, along with Lawrence Kohlberg and the philosopher John Rawls, so he was well acquainted with their brand of rationalist theorizing about rights and justice. It seemed clear to Wilson that what the rationalists were really doing was generating clever justifications for moral intuitions that were best explained by evolution. Do people really believe in human rights because such rights actually exist, like mathematical truths sitting on a cosmic shelf next to the Pythagorean theorem just waiting to be discovered by Platonic reasoners? Or do people feel revulsion and sympathy when they read accounts of torture, and then invent a story about universal rights to help justify their feelings? Wilson sided with Hume. He charged that what moral philosophers were really doing was fabricating justifications after consulting the emotive centers of their own brains. End quote. Okay, so that was a somewhat long section there, but he's kind of laying out these multiple different versions. You've got the rationalist version. He traces that back to Plato, which says that reason is and should be the master over the emotions, and it is the primary mechanism by which we can determine moral systems. And he talks about rationalists, Lawrence Kohlberg and John Rawls, and then there's the model put forward by David Hume, which essentially says that rationality is the slave to the emotions. And then there's the third version that he puts forward by Jefferson that says, okay, well, the head and the heart, or the rationality and the emotional centers, simply have different areas of rulership, so that the rational faculties rule over scientific endeavors, calculative functions, and then the emotional heart, the emotional centers of the human being rule over interpersonal areas that deal with things like love. He says sympathy, benevolence, gratitude, justice, love, friendship, all of those things belong to the heart. Those are areas that belong to the emotional centers. And so he's got these three sort of areas, and then when E.O. Wilson comes along, Wilson seems to agree with Hume that people's ideas about morality are generated by emotional responses to suffering and torture, and then these systems, these rational systems of human rights, are devised to justify the intuitive emotional responses that the philosophers and professors have to these sorts of things. So, and he mentions Steven Pinker, the book that he talks about there. I reviewed that book a few episodes back. Actually, that was pretty early back in the series, but it's the same general point that he makes, that moral philosophers in the 20th century harshly rejected the concept of nativism or inborn moral systems and inborn traits in general in favor of a blank slate theory, because the blank slate theory was more conducive to progressive ideology. Rather than simply pursuing truth, they conformed truth, they shaped truth to fit into their ideological frame. And so that the pursuit of science and truth was not the most important agenda of these scientists in the 60s and 70s. And so that's kind of some information that I had talked about previously. In this book, he does kind of back away from the Hume perspective a little bit and move a little bit toward the Jeffersonian era. I think that the last book that we looked at, Thinking Fast and Slow, does sort of support that Jeffersonian approach to an extent, to say that there are some areas where we think things through, and then there are some areas where we have intuitive responses, but they're so bound together that it's not easy to simply divide them up and say, well, you do this and then you do that. They both work together with each other. So I'm going to move on from there to the part where he mentions the rider and the elephant. In this section, he says, quote, "Moral judgment is a cognitive process, as are all forms of judgment. The crucial distinction is really between two kinds of cognition, intuition and reasoning. Moral emotions are one type of moral intuition, but most moral intuitions are more subtle. They don't rise to the level of emotions. The next time you read a newspaper or drive a car, notice the many tiny flashes of condemnation that flit through your consciousness. Is each such flash an emotion? Or ask yourself whether it is better to save the lives of 5 strangers or 1, assuming all else is equal. Do you need an emotion to tell you to go for the 5? Do you need reasoning? No, you just see instantly that 5 is better than 1. Intuition is the best word to describe the dozens or hundreds of rapid, effortless moral judgments and decisions that we all make every day. Only a few of these intuitions come to us embedded in full-blown emotions. In the happiness hypothesis, I call these two kinds of cognition the rider, controlled processes, including reasoning why, and the elephant, automatic processes, including emotion, intuitions, and all forms of seeing that. I chose an elephant rather than a horse because elephants are so much bigger and smarter than horses. Automatic processes run the human mind, just as they have been running animal minds for 500 million years, so they're very good at what they do, like software that has been improved through thousands of product cycles. When human beings evolved the capacity for language and reasoning, at some point in the last million years, the brain did not rewire itself to hand over the reins to a new and inexperienced charioteer. Rather, the rider, language-based reasoning, evolved because it did something useful for the elephant. The rider can do several useful things. It can see further into the future because we can examine alternative scenarios in our heads, and therefore it can help the elephant make better decisions in the present. It can learn new skills and master new technologies which can be deployed to help the elephant reach its goals and sidestep disasters. And most important, the rider acts as the spokesman for the elephant, even though it doesn't necessarily know what the elephant is really thinking. The rider is skilled at fabricating post hoc explanations for whatever the elephant has just done, and it is good at finding reasons to justify whatever the elephant wants to do next. Once human beings developed language and began to use it to gossip about each other, it became extremely valuable for elephants to carry around on their backs a full-time public relations firm." End quote. So there you have the basics of the rider and the elephant, and again, that really corresponds pretty closely with the System 1 and System 2, and essentially that the System 1, or the elephant, the intuitive reactions, are the same. That's the same form of cognition that animals have, and that the rider, or the calculative function, the System 2, evolved over time to assist the elephant, to assist the intuitive. So it's not that the intuitions necessarily assist the cognitive function, it might, or the calculative function, the rider, it might seem that way, but really the rider evolved after the elephant in order to assist the elephant, if you will, in order to assist our intuitions and to provide them with more information in order to make better judgments. So there's that basic premise. So now he brings it back to rationalism, and I'm kind of jumping around a little bit. This isn't necessarily, the quotes or the areas I'm reading are not necessarily sequential. I'm jumping forward a little bit here, but he says in this section, when he talks about rationalism, he says, quote, "Webster's Third New International Dictionary defines delusion as a false conception and persistent belief unconquerable by reason in something that has no existence in fact. As an intuitionist, I'd say that the worship of reason is itself an illustration of one of the most long-lived delusions in Western history, the Rationalist Delusion. It's the idea that reasoning is our most noble attribute, one that makes us like the gods, for Plato, or that brings us beyond the delusion of believing in gods, for the new atheists. The rationalist delusion is not just a claim about human nature, it's also a claim that the rational caste, philosophers or scientists, should have more power, and it usually comes along with a utopian program for raising more rational children. From Plato through Kant and Kohlberg, many rationalists have asserted that the ability to reason well about ethical issues causes good behavior. They believe that reasoning is the royal road to moral truth, and they believe that people who reason well are more likely to act morally. But if that were the case, then moral philosophers who reason about ethical principles all day long should be more virtuous than other people. Are they? the philosopher Erich Schweizgebel tried to find out. He used surveys and more surreptitious methods to measure how often moral philosophers give to charity, vote, call their mothers, donate blood, donate organs, clean up after themselves at philosophy conferences, and respond to emails purportedly from students. And in none of these ways are moral philosophers better than other philosophers or professors in other fields. Schweizgebel even scrounged up the missing book lists from dozens of libraries and found that academic books on ethics, which are presumably borrowed mostly by ethicists, are more likely to be stolen or just never returned than books in other areas of philosophy. In other words, expertise in moral reasoning does not seem to improve moral behavior, and it might even make it worse, perhaps by making the writer more skilled at post hoc justification. Schweizgebel still has yet to find a single measure on which moral philosophers behave better than other philosophers. Anyone who values truth should take a cold, hard look at the evidence and see reasoning for what it is. The French cognitive scientists Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber recently reviewed the vast research literature on motivated reasoning in social psychology and on the biases and errors of reasoning in cognitive psychology. They concluded that most of the bizarre and depressing research findings make perfect sense once you see reasoning as having evolved not to help us find truth, but to help us engage in arguments, persuasion, and manipulation in the context of discussions with other people. As they put it, skilled arguers are not after the truth, but after arguments supporting their views. This explains why the confirmation bias is so powerful and so ineradicable. How hard could it be to teach students to look at the other side, to look for evidence against their favored view? Yet, in fact, it's very hard, and nobody has yet found a way to do it. It's hard because the confirmation bias is a built-in feature of an argumentative mind, not a bug that can be removed from a Platonic mind. I'm not saying we should all stop reasoning and go with our gut feelings. Gut feelings are sometimes better guides than reasoning for making consumer choices and interpersonal judgments, but they are often disastrous as a basis for public policy, science, and law. Rather, what I'm saying is that we must be wary of any individual's ability to reason. We should see each individual as being limited, like a neuron. A neuron is really good at one thing: summing up the stimulation coming into its dendrites to decide whether to fire a pulse along its axon. A neuron, by itself, isn't very smart, but if you put neurons together in the right way, you get a brain. You get an emergent system that is much smarter and more flexible than a single neuron. In the same way, each individual reasoner is really good at one thing: finding evidence to support the position he or she already holds, usually for intuitive reasons. We should not expect individuals to produce good, open-minded, truth-seeking reasoning, particularly when self-interest or reputational concerns are in play. But if you put individuals together in the right way, such that some individuals can use their reasoning powers to disconfirm the claims of others, and all individuals feel some common bond or shared fate that allows them to interact civilly, you can create a group that ends up producing good reasoning as an emergent property of the social system. This is why it's so important to have intellectual and ideological diversity within any group or institution whose goal is to find truth, such as an intelligence agency or a community of scientists, or to produce good public policy such as a legislature or advisory board. And if our goal is to produce good behavior, not just good thinking, then it's even more important to reject rationalism and embrace intuitionism. Nobody is ever going to invent an ethics class that makes people behave ethically after they step out of the classroom. classes are for riders, and riders are just going to use their new knowledge to serve their elephants more effectively. If you want to make people behave more ethically, there are two ways you can go. You can change the elephant, which takes a long time and is hard to do, or to borrow an idea from the book Switch by Chip Heath and Dan Heath, you can change the path that the elephant and rider find themselves traveling on. You can make minor and inexpensive tweaks to the environment, which can produce big increases in ethical behavior. End quote. So, in that section, he just really kind of goes after rationalism hardcore. That's like he's delivering the killing blow here, that rationalism does not make people more better ethical actors. Like professors of ethics don't behave better than anybody else. And so no matter how much time and effort one might spend rationalizing about ethical behavior, it doesn't in any way make people behave ethically. And so there's really kind of the proof that we're looking for, that rationalism is not a path to good ethical behavior or ethical knowledge or anything of that sort. It's intuition that's kind of driving ethical behavior. And rationalism serves the rider of the elephant to create systems of justification, to justify what has been done or what is going to be done. And then he says that the best way to actually alter ethical behavior is by changing the environment in which the elephant and the rider operate. And he mentions a book, Switch. There's a book called Nudge that follows along that similar theory. I haven't read either of these books, but I know kind of what they're about. I have Nudge. I haven't read it yet, but I'm thinking about maybe adding that into the mix of my reviews at some point. But it really talks about the way that we can make subtle changes in our social environment in order to encourage one sort of behavior or another. That's sort of maybe a controversial idea among the hardcore libertarians, insofar as trying to subtly and perhaps even subconsciously manipulate human behavior. But, it happens all the time anyway. But that's kind of going down a tangent I don't want to go down right now. But he's really going at, he calls it the Rationalist Delusion, and he's really going after rationalism. And the other thing that I think is interesting in that section, when he talks about the neurons and the brain, really in the sense that no individual person is going to be able to reason freely because they're so bound to the instructions given to them by their own intuitions or their own elephant. And so we shouldn't put any real amount of faith in any single rational person, but that when you put a bunch of people together, they have the capacity to disprove each other, and they've got elephants moving in different directions, and this is where you get the call for ideological diversity, and that all together this group of people can kind of begin to find a correct approach. And this ties in sort of with the constrained vision that no person's rationality is capable of, or even a committee of people's rationality capable of figuring out the right way to behave, the right way to build an institution, the right way to perform governmental duties. The more dispersed authority is, the more we begin to eliminate the problem of the rider being so controlled by the elephant, because in a large group of people, there are a large number of elephants moving in different directions, and you can kind of get the sense that, okay, well, 60% of the elephants are moving in this direction, 40% are moving in that direction. Now we begin to say maybe the 60% direction is the right direction, rather than going to any single person and expecting them to be able to see things clearly like that. And so, just continuing along the same theme, most of the sections that I'm reading here have to do with this same theme, because it does tie in back with much of the stuff that we have talked about in previous episodes. This rationalism, we talked about rationalism and empiricism. We talked about idealism and realism. We talked about the blank slate versus human nature. And so we've talked about this in a number of areas, and so I think at this point we're really kind of putting the capstone on this argument before we begin to move into some other new arguments that we'll get to later on in the book that will open up whole new avenues of discussion. But here I just want to read this section here about rationalism and morality. And this is not a particularly long section, but I think it's going to start to bring us to our conclusion insofar as this topic. So here he says, quote, "Nowadays, secular people often see the Enlightenment as a battle between two mortal enemies. On one side was science with its principal weapon, reason, and on the other was religion with its ancient shield of superstition. Reason defeated superstition. Light replaced darkness. But when David Hume was alive, he was fighting a three-way battle. Enlightenment thinkers were united in rejecting divine revelation as the source of moral knowledge, but they were divided as to whether morality transcended human nature, that is, it emerged from the very nature of rationality and could therefore be deduced by reasoning, as Plato believed, or whether morality was a part of human nature, like language or taste, which had to be studied by observation. Given Hume's concerns about the limits of reasoning, he believed that philosophers who tried to reason their way to moral truth without looking at human nature were no better than theologians who thought they could find moral truth revealed in sacred texts. Both were transcendentalists. Hume's work on morality was the quintessential Enlightenment project, an exploration of an area previously owned by religion using the methods and attitudes of the new natural sciences. His first great work, A Treatise of Human Nature, had this subtitle: being an attempt to introduce the experimental method of reasoning into moral subjects. Hume believed that moral science had to begin with careful inquiry into what humans are actually like. And when he examined human nature, in history, in political affairs, and among his fellow philosophers, he saw that sentiment, or intuition, is the driving force of our moral lives, whereas reasoning is biased and impotent, fit primarily to be a servant of the passions. He also saw a diversity of virtues, and he rejected attempts by some of his contemporaries to reduce all of morality to a single virtue, such as kindness, or to do away with virtues and replace them with a few moral laws. Because he thought that morality was based in a variety of sentiments, which give us pleasure when we encounter virtue and displeasure when we encounter vice, Hume often relied upon sensory analogies, and particularly the taste analogy. Quote, morality is nothing in the abstract nature of things, but is entirely relative to the sentiment or mental taste of each particular being. In the same manner as distinctions of sweet and bitter, hot and cold, arise from the particular feeling of each sense or organ, moral perceptions, therefore, ought not to be classed with the operations of the understanding, but with the tastes or sentiments. End quote. Moral judgment is a kind of perception, and moral science should begin with a careful study of the moral taste receptors. You can't possibly deduce the list of 5 taste receptors by pure reasoning, nor should you search for it in Scripture. There's nothing transcendental about them. You've got to examine the tongue. Hume got it right. When he died in 1776, he and other sentimentalists had laid a superb foundation for moral science, one that has, in my view, been largely vindicated by modern research. You would think, then, that in the decades after his death, the moral sciences progressed rapidly, but you would be wrong. In the decades after Hume's death, the rationalists claimed victory over religion and took the moral sciences off on a 200-year tangent. End quote. So he's really talking there about David Hume. I haven't talked much about David Hume yet, but David Hume is a really pretty interesting character. He was probably one of the more conservative of the Enlightenment thinkers. He was also one of the more atheistic of the Enlightenment thinkers, and his notion about reasoning and rationality being subject to the sentiments, and that morality is really a function of sentiments or intuitions and not a function of reasoning, and that it can be equated to the taste buds. That's really where he, there's an idea in this book that begins here in this idea that morality is like the taste buds, and you can't rationally deduce the concepts of sweet and sour, salty, bitter. You can't deduce these things through rationality, and you're not going to find them described adequately in Scripture. You have to look at the tongue. You have to examine the way that people respond to food. It's observational. It's a result of empirical study that you're going to find out what the taste buds of a person are like. And in the same way, the variety of moral sentiments are similar to taste buds. We have these inborn measures of morality. And it's not just, and the other important thing that he says there is it's not just one thing like kindness that everything revolves around. It's a variety of virtues. Like there's a variety of taste buds. There's a variety of different flavors and tastes that you can taste when you eat food. There's similarly a variety of virtues. There's a variety of moral foundations, and they're fundamental and natural and inborn to the human mind. That's David Hume's argument, and he says basically David Hume was right. But the rationalists claimed victory, and they decided that they were going to explore morality from a rationalistic perspective, and then you get the work of Immanuel Kant and his ethical system, which has shaped our understanding of ethics for hundreds of years. But it's not a realistic approach to our ethical systems. And so we've been kind of going the wrong way for hundreds of years trying to build these rational moral systems. So that's his argument there. At that point, let's see, what am I moving on to now? Okay, so then we begin to ask, what is the purpose of these moral systems? Because from an evolutionary perspective, everything that we have, every part of our bodies and every part of our minds, since our brain is part of our body, every mental function and every physical function or every physical capacity has a purpose in helping us to survive. And so where do morals fit in that system? So in this part he says, quote, "Suppose the gods were to flip a coin on the day of your birth. Heads, you would be a supremely honest and fair person throughout your life, yet everyone around you will believe you're a scoundrel. Tails, you will cheat and lie whenever it suits your needs, yet everyone around you will believe you're a paragon of virtue. Which outcome would you prefer?" Plato's Republic, one of the most influential works in the Western canon, is an extended argument that you should pick heads for your own good. It is better to be than to seem virtuous. Early in the Republic, Glaucon, Plato's brother, challenges Socrates to prove that justice itself, and not merely the reputation for justice, leads to happiness. Glaucon asks Socrates to imagine what would happen to a man who had the mythical ring of Gyges, a gold ring that makes its wearer invisible at will. Quote, "Now, no one, it seems, would be so incorruptible that he would stay on the path of justice, or stay away from other people's property, when he could take whatever he wanted from the marketplace with impunity, go into people's houses and have sex with anyone he wished, kill or release from prison anyone he wished, and do all the other things that would make him like a god among humans. Rather, his actions would be in no way different from those of an unjust person, and both would follow the same path." End quote. Glaucon's thought experiment implies that people are only virtuous because they fear the consequences of getting caught, especially the damage to their reputations. Glaucon says he will not be satisfied until Socrates can prove that a just man with a bad reputation is happier than an unjust man who is widely thought to be good. It is quite a challenge, and Socrates approaches it with an analogy. Justice in a man is like justice in a city, a polis or city-state. He then argues that a just city is one in which there is harmony, cooperation, and a division of labor between all the castes. Farmers farm, carpenters build, and rulers rule. All contribute to the common good, and all lament when misfortune happens to any of them. But in an unjust city, one group's gain is another's loss. Faction schemes against faction. The powerful exploit the weak, and the city is divided against itself. To make sure the polis doesn't descend into the chaos of ruthless self-interest, Socrates says that the philosophers must rule, for only they will pursue what is truly good and not just what is good for themselves. Having gotten his listeners to agree to this picture of a just, harmonious, and happy city, Socrates then argues that exactly these sorts of relationships apply within a just, harmonious, and happy person. If philosophers must rule the happy city, then reason must rule the happy person. And if reason rules, then it cares about what is truly good, not just about the appearance of virtue. Plato, who had been a student of Socrates, had a coherent set of beliefs about human nature, and at the core of these beliefs was his faith in the perfectibility of reason. Reason is our original nature, he thought. It was given to us by the gods and installed in our spherical heads. Passions often corrupt reason, but if we can learn to control these passions, our God-given rationality will shine forth and guide us to do the right thing, not the popular thing. As is often the case in moral philosophy, arguments about what we ought to do depend upon assumptions, often unstated, about human nature and human psychology. And for Plato, the assumed psychology is just plain wrong. Reason is not fit to rule. It was designed to seek justification, not truth. Glaucon was right. People care a great deal more about appearance and reputation than about reality. In fact, I'll praise Glaucon for the rest of the book as the guy who got it right. The guy who realized that the most important principle for designing an ethical society is to make sure that everyone's reputation is on the line all the time so that bad behavior will always bring bad consequences. William James, one of the founders of American psychology, urged psychologists to take a functionalist approach to the mind. That means examining things in terms of what they do within a larger system. The function of the heart is to pump blood within the circulatory system, and you can't understand the heart unless you keep that in mind. James applied the same logic to psychology. If you want to understand any mental mechanism or process, you have to know its function within some larger system. Thinking is for doing, he said. What then is the function of moral reasoning? Does it seem to have been shaped, tuned, and crafted by natural selection to help us find the truth, so that we can know the right way to behave and condemn those who behave wrongly? If you believe that, then you are a rationalist, like Plato, Socrates, and Kohlberg. Or does moral reasoning seem to have been shaped, tuned, and crafted to help us pursue socially strategic goals, such as guarding our reputations and convincing other people to support us or our team in disputes? If you believe that, then you are a Glauconian. End quote. Okay, so in that section, he basically says that the reason that we have thoughts at all, the reason that we have minds and calculative functions, and the reason that we have rationality and everything else, the reason that we think is so that it can help us act. We don't have these faculties because we are in pursuit of the truth. Seeking the truth is not the function, odd as it sounds, seeking the truth is not the function of rationality. the function of rationality is to help us survive. Like everything comes down to the selfish gene, right? Like everything that we do, every part of our body, every part of our brain comes down to the simple act of pursuing genetic survival. Passing on our genes, duplicating our genes and passing them on and helping them to survive. And so our moral reasoning doesn't serve us to find some sort of moral truth. It serves us to help us survive in groups, to help other people trust us so that we can function in the group, so that we can engage in reciprocal behavior, so that we can engage in division of labor and the other things that human beings do. We have these moral codes and these moral sensibilities for the purpose of surviving. And so he talks about the reputation, that really what we're trying to do is to have this reputation. He says, is it better to be, or is it going to make you more happy in their pursuit of happiness here? Is it going to make you more happy to be a person who is virtuous all the time and yet is consistently understood to be a villain? Or is it better to be a selfish villain who is always and consistently understood to be a moral paragon and to always be looked up as a morally upright person? Now, of course, we might have a sort of sense of inner disgust at the idea of being this morally villainous person. What am I going to be? A murderer, a rapist, a thief? What is that going to make me happy to do? But if you think about it, a lot of things that we do, we're always kind of evaluating. I mean, if people just behaved good, we wouldn't have laws, right? We have laws in the hope that they act as deterrents. The real truth is that there are many circumstances in which people would not have quite as strict of a moral code if they thought that the world was watching, or that the world was not watching them. If they thought that they could get away with all these activities, they would certainly not be quite so morally upright as they are, knowing that they run the risk of punishment for things that they do. And not just legal punishment, but that they would have this tarnished reputation if they were to do some of the things that they would like to do, but they don't do, in order to protect their reputations. And that's just reality. That's just the reality of human beings. And it's not something that he's proposing here, and it's not just like, if you go back to Plato, these are just arguments about the way people are. But nowadays we have very involved psychological research that says that when people believe they're being observed, they behave in a more, what is understood to be a moral manner. They don't steal. They don't cheat. If they think that they're going to get away with something, if they think that they're acting anonymously and that there are going to be no repercussions, they don't act as morally upright. And that's just human nature. Now, is that the way we should be? Well, it's the way we are, and there's no other way around it. So it's pointless to ask whether that's the way that we should be. We of course we think it's the way we should be, but we almost say that we think it's the way it should be because we have that reputation to uphold, and it's so deeply ingrained in our behavior that we can't always even see it. And it's not something that we've learned, and we're trying, and we would have to unlearn. It's like embedded in us. So with that, I think I've run the course of the parts that I want to talk about regarding rationalism. This is going to be one of my longer podcasts because there's still a few parts I want to read that now we're going to begin to open up a new avenue of discussion that is going to lead us into our next several books. So at this point, I'm really going to begin to slowly move away from the conversation about rationalism versus empiricism, rationalism versus intuitionism, idealism versus realism. Those obviously are going to continue to be important parts of this conversation, but I want to start to open up another avenue of thought, and I'm going to begin to open that by reading this section here. So in this section, he says, quote, "In 2010, the cultural psychologists Joe Henrich, Steve Hine and Ara Norenzayan published a profoundly important article titled "The Weirdest People in the World." The authors pointed out that nearly all research in psychology is conducted on a very small subset of the human population. People from cultures that are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, forming the acronym WEIRD. They then reviewed dozens of studies showing that weird people are statistical outliers, that they are the least typical, least representative people you could study if you wanted to make generalizations about human nature. Even within the West, Americans are more extreme outliers than Europeans, and within the United States, the educated upper middle class is the most unusual of all. Several of the peculiarities of weird culture can be captured in this simple generalization. The weirder you are, the more you see a world full of separate objects rather than relationships. It has long been reported that Westerners have a more independent and autonomous concept of the self than do East Asians. For example, when asked to write 20 statements beginning with the words "I am," Americans are likely to list their own internal psychological characteristics: happy, outgoing, interested in jazz. Whereas East Asians are more likely to list their roles and relationships: a son, a husband, an employee of Fujitsu. The differences run deep. Even visual perception is affected. In what's known as the framed line task, you are shown a square with a line drawn inside it. You then turn the page and see an empty square that is larger or smaller than the original square. Your task is to draw a line that is the same as the line you saw on the previous page, either in absolute terms, same number of centimeters, ignore the new frame, or in relative terms, same proportion relative to the frame. Westerners, and particularly Americans, excel at the absolute task because they saw the line as an independent object in the first place and stored it separately in memory. East Asians, in contrast, outperform Americans at the relative task because they automatically perceived and remembered the relationship among the parts. Related to this difference in perception is a difference in thinking style. Most people think holistically, seeing the whole context and the relationship among parts. But weird people think more analytically, detaching the focal object from its context, assigning it to a category, and assuming that what's true about the category is true about the object. Putting this all together, it makes sense that weird philosophers, since Kant and Mill, have mostly generated moral systems that are individualistic, rule-based, and universalist. That's the morality that you need to govern a society of autonomous individuals. But when holistic thinkers in a non-weird culture write about morality, we get something more like the Analects of Confucius, a collection of aphorisms and anecdotes that can't be reduced to a single rule. Confucius talks about a variety of relationship-specific duties and virtues, such as filial piety and the proper treatment of one's subordinates. If weird and non-weird people think differently, and see the world differently, then it stands to reason they'd have different moral concerns. If you see a world full of individuals, then you'll probably want the morality of Kohlberg and Turiel, a morality that protects those individuals and their individual rights. You'll emphasize concerns about harm and fairness. But if you live in a non-weird society, in which people are more likely to see relationships, contexts, groups, and institutions, then you won't be so focused on protecting individuals. You'll have a more sociocentric morality, which means that you place the needs of groups and institutions first, often ahead of the needs of individuals. If you do that, then a morality based on concerns about harm and fairness won't be sufficient. You'll have additional concerns, and you'll need additional virtues to bind people together." End quote. So this is, I think, super important. This concept of the weird individual, and basically when you look throughout history, and you look throughout the modern world, you find a tremendous amount of people have adhered to this non-weird view of people, of human nature, and of moral systems, and only a sort of an abnormal sliver of humanity adheres to this weird way of viewing the world, this Western, educated, industrial-rich democracy. So there's two sorts of moral systems. There's the weird and then the non-weird. And actually, as he develops in this book, there's a difference between the modern liberal and the modern conservative, in that the modern liberal takes this concept of the weird to the maximum degree, whereas the modern conservative fits more into the non-weird perspective in many ways. Their concepts of morality are not as totally focused on the individual. Now, obviously, there's a difference between the more traditionalist conservative and, say, the more libertarian type. The libertarian type is going to be more weird in their moral system. But there's a sort of a distinction here that I think is really interesting and important. He talks about care, harm, he talks about fairness, and he talks about how the weird are really focused on, because they're focused on individuals, they're focused on, make sure that you don't hurt the individual in any way, you don't cause any kind of disruption to the individual, you're all about the individual rights. And then in the non-weird, you're more concerned about the community as a whole. So sometimes the individual has to be subservient to the needs of the greater community. And this is how humans have always behaved. This is how humans across the world in non-weird societies today behave. And you'll find that actually there's much of modern conservatism that views things in this way. And I think that's really interesting. And we're going to be exploring this concept in greater detail as we go. So moving on to the next section that pertains to this concept, he talks about a plethora of different moral systems. So this kind of ties back to that concept about the taste buds being a sort of an analogy for morality. He lays out, well, in this section, this is kind of a summary. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about these different moral taste buds, if you will. I'm just going to give a brief summary of them. He goes into much more detail about them, but to really get the nitty-gritty, you're going to have to go pick up the book. But I'll give you sort of an overview. There's one that he doesn't mention, but the ones that he does mention here, he mentions 5 of them. He says, the care-harm foundation evolved in response to the adaptive challenge of caring for vulnerable children. It makes us sensitive to signs of suffering and need. It makes us despise cruelty and want to care for those who are suffering. The fairness cheating foundation evolved in response to the adaptive challenge of reaping the rewards of cooperation without getting exploited. It makes us sensitive to indications that another person is likely to be a good or bad partner for collaboration and reciprocal altruism. It makes us want to shun or punish cheaters. The loyalty betrayal foundation evolved in response to the adaptive challenge of forming and maintaining coalitions. It makes us sensitive to signs that another person is or is not a team player. It makes us trust and reward such people, and it makes us want to hurt, ostracize, or even kill those who betray us or our group. The authority subversion foundation evolved in response to the adaptive challenge of forging relationships that will benefit us within social hierarchies. It makes us sensitive to signs of rank or status and to signs that other people are or are not behaving properly given their position. The sanctity-degradation foundation evolved initially in response to the adaptive challenge of the omnivore's dilemma, and then to the broader challenge of living in a world of pathogens and parasites. It includes the behavioral immune system, which can make us wary of a diverse array of symbolic objects and threats. It makes it possible for people to invest objects with irrational and extreme values, both positive and negative, which are important for binding groups together. He says, the two ends of the political spectrum rely upon each foundation in different ways or to different degrees. It appears that the left relies primarily on the care and fairness foundations, whereas the right uses all five. If this is true, does left-wing morality activate just one or two taste receptors, whereas right-wing morality engages a broader palette, including loyalty, authority, and sanctity? And if so, does that give conservative politicians a broader variety of ways to connect with voters? End quote. So then the one he doesn't mention here is the Liberty Oppression Foundation, which he developed later in his career. These are five of the earlier ones that he developed, and then he added in this liberty dimension to the moral codes. And I would say, in looking at this, that I think there are probably a number of other concerns that don't get introduced in this section that might be considered. And it depends on how broad of a definition of morality you're going to use. But if you say, for a man to be physically weak versus physically strong, is that a moral dimension? Is it morally right for a man to be physically powerful and to work out and do what is necessary to ensure that he has some degree of physical power, or to allow himself to remain in a state of weakness? Is it morally right to try to seek excellence in the tasks that you do, or to have a good work ethic or a bad work ethic? I think there are a number of areas that you could say have moral dimensions or could be considered virtues that aren't necessarily covered by these 5 or even 6 different taste buds that he identifies. I think it could even be expanded if you sort of loosen the definition of morality and virtue. There are a lot of other things that could be seen as correct or incorrect behavior, where the right has a tendency to say, yeah, there's this on this sort of spectrum, there's right behavior and wrong behavior, whereas the left is so zeroed in on this care harm foundation and the fairness foundation. And he talks a little bit about the fairness and how it differs, and I'll get into that in a little bit here. And I think it's really interesting, 2 things here that he talks about. And actually, before I get into that, let me just read this last section that I want to read, where he goes into more detail about this exact thing. And then I want to make a few comments that will lead us into some of our future studies. So here he says, quote, "Moral foundations theory says that there are at least 6 psychological systems that comprise the universal foundations of the world's many moral matrices. The various moralities found on the political left tend to rest most strongly on the care, harm, and liberty, oppression foundations. These 2 foundations support ideals of social justice, which emphasize compassion for the poor and a struggle for political equality among the subgroups that comprise society. Social justice movements emphasize solidarity. They call for people to come together to fight the oppression of bullying, domineering elites. This is why there is no separate equality foundation. People don't crave equality for its own sake. They fight for equality when they perceive they are being bullied or dominated, as during the American and French revolutions and the cultural revolutions of the 1960s. Everyone, left, right, and center, cares about care-harm, but liberals care more. Across many scales, surveys, and political controversies, liberals turn out to be more disturbed by signs of violence and suffering compared to conservatives and especially to libertarians. Everyone, left, right, and center, cares about liberty oppression, but each political faction cares in a different way. In the contemporary United States, liberals are most concerned about the rights of certain vulnerable groups, example, racial minorities, children, animals, and they look to government to defend the weak against oppression by the strong. Conservatives, in contrast, hold more traditional ideas of liberty as the right to be left alone, and they often resent liberal programs that use government to infringe on their liberties in order to protect the groups that liberals care most about. For example, small business owners overwhelmingly support the Republican Party, in part because they resent the government telling them how to run their businesses under its banner of protecting workers, minorities, consumers, and the environment. This helps explain why libertarians have sided with the Republican Party in recent decades. Libertarians care about liberty almost to the exclusion of all other concerns, and their conception of liberty is the same as that of the Republicans. It is the right to be left alone, free from government interference. The fairness cheating doctrine is about proportionality and the law of karma. It is about making sure that people get what they deserve and do not get things they do not deserve. Everyone, left, right, and center, cares about proportionality. Everyone gets angry when people take more than they deserve. But conservatives care more, and they rely on the fairness foundation more heavily once fairness is restricted to proportionality. For example, how relevant is it to your morality whether everyone is pulling their own weight? Do you agree that employees who work the hardest should be paid the most? Liberals don't reject these items, but they are ambivalent. Conservatives, in contrast, endorse items such as these enthusiastically. Liberals may think that they own the concept of karma because of its New Age associations, but a morality based on compassion and concerns about oppression forces you to violate karma or proportionality in many ways. Conservatives, for example, think it's self-evident that responses to crime should be based on proportionality, as shown in slogans such as "do the crime, do the time," and "3 strikes and you're out." Yet liberals are often uncomfortable with the negative side of karma, retribution. After all, retribution causes harm, and harm activates the care-harm foundation. A recent study even found that liberal professors give out a narrower range of grades than do conservative professors. Conservative professors are more willing to reward the best students and punish the worst. The remaining 3 foundations, loyalty betrayal, authority subversion, and sanctity degradation, show the biggest and most consistent partisan differences. Liberals are ambivalent about these foundations at best, whereas social conservatives embrace them. Libertarians have little use for them, which is why they tend to support liberal positions on social issues such as gay marriage, drug use, and laws to protect the American flag. Liberals have a 3-foundation morality, whereas conservatives use all 6. Liberal moral matrices rest on the care-harm, liberty oppression, and fairness cheating foundations, although liberals are often willing to trade away fairness as proportionality when it conflicts with compassion or with their desire to fight oppression. Conservative morality rests on all 6 foundations, although conservatives are more willing than liberals to sacrifice care and let some people get hurt in order to achieve their many other moral objectives. End quote. Okay, so that there, again, this is sort of the foundation of some of the stuff that we'll be talking about in some upcoming books. There's 2 things to think about here. Number one, why do liberals focus so much on a few of them? And I would even argue, in my experience, that the the care-harm foundation almost becomes exclusive, that you cannot harm people or restrict them in any way. But also, like, the liberty oppression is sort of ties into that. Like, if you're oppressing someone, then you're harming them, and so to hold this oppression at bay and to hold is in a way to hold harm at bay. And so it's and if you get down to the nature of care and harm, like to help someone in some way is a form of self-sacrifice. Like if you give something to someone, then you've sacrificed having that thing for yourself. Anytime that you even devote some of your time, and this is something that is explored in reciprocal altruism and some of the other books that we've looked at. Anytime that you make some sort of a sacrifice of yourself to help other people, like that's necessary in order to advance that care harm foundation. Like to pass somebody who is suffering and not help them is considered to harm them when you could have sacrificed of yourself to help them. And much of the liberal approach really centers on that. And then the conservative approach tends to be more well-rounded, to say that all of these different virtues, these different moral foundations, as he calls them, they're all important, but none of them are taken to the extreme. So then this starts to tie back to some of the stuff that we looked at in Aristotle regarding the mean of not taking anything to an excess. That it might be argued that the liberal takes the care-harm foundation to an excess and has a deficiency in all of the other areas, with the exception perhaps of the liberty oppression approach. Because honestly, I don't think that when you talk about fairness as proportionality, that everybody gets what they deserve and nothing more and nothing less, and are punished appropriately and are rewarded appropriately. That, to me, tends to be more of a conservative approach. Now it seems like equality, but what you really mean by equality when you're talking about equality of outcome, that doesn't have anything to do with proportionality. That concept of equality of outcome is all built on the care foundation. Because for somebody to have more than somebody else, is the person who has less is harmed by the fact that they don't have as much. And that trumps the concept of proportionality. So so the question is, on one hand, why is the liberal moral approach so unbalanced in favor of the care foundation? Question one, why is it so unbalanced? And question two, why is it unbalanced in that particular direction? I guess is how I would split it up into the two necessary questions to ask. But yeah, the most of the world follows this more conservative. So this, like the whole concept of the weird, like the weird approach is the modern liberal approach, because the conservative moral array is more similar to the moral array everywhere else in the world, that the non-weird societies and all the societies throughout history that have been non-weird societies have had this balance of virtues. And he talks about that in the book as well. There's a balance of different virtues that has been demonstrated everywhere up until the rise of the weird societies. So anyway, this podcast has gone on for quite a long time. Pick up this book, again, highly, highly recommended. And those topics that we began to introduce in the end of this podcast are going to be some of the things that we will continue to talk about in some upcoming episodes. So I'm going to cut it off now. I thank you very much for tuning in and hope that you come back to tune in to the next episode. Bye.